They said the winter of 1885 would kill anyone foolish enough to stay on that ridge. She had every reason to leave. She chose to read instead. And inside that journal, a map, a tunnel, a question no one had dared ask. The town had already buried her in their minds. She picked up the shovel anyway.
She was wrong about one thing. She was not alone.
A man crawls through snow that reaches his chest. The ice has opened cuts along his cheekbones, thin red lines that the cold seals almost as fast as they form. His lungs have stopped feeling like lungs. They feel like something broken and stuffed back into the wrong cavity. He is the wealthiest man in Copperhead Gulch, Colorado, owner of the only sawmill within 40 miles, builder of every decent structure in this town. A man who has never in 58 years been wrong about wood or weather or the limits of what a woman alone could survive. Harlan Beckett is crawling through a blizzard toward what he is certain will be 2 frozen bodies in a hole in the ground. A young widow. A 6-year-old boy, he told her. The whole town told her. He is wrong about everything, but he does not know that yet. He will not know it for another 3 miles of uphill snow. Pull that image back. Hold it. Then let it dissolve into the cold light of 8 months earlier, into the small particular grief of an April morning in 1885, when the aspens along Redtail Ridge were just beginning to push out their first pale leaves. They buried Calvin Whitmore on a Thursday in ground so recently thawed that the gravedigger's shovel still scraped against pockets of frost. The coffin was plain pine, and Dessa Whitmore stood at its edge in a black dress that belonged to a warmer funeral in a warmer place. She did not feel the cold. She did not feel the wind lifting her hair, or the grit of half-frozen dirt landing on her boots as the sexton worked. She felt nothing at all, which was its own kind of mercy, because what waited on the other side of that nothing was a thing she could not yet afford to face. Birch stood beside her, 6 years old, with his father's dark, watchful eyes and a stillness that most children his age had not yet learned. He held Calvin's leather sketchbook pressed flat against his sternum with both arms, the way you hold something you are afraid someone will try to take. He had not put it down since the men carried Calvin home on a wooden board. He slept with it. He ate with his elbow curved around it on the table. He held it now while Reverend Aldrich shaped the right words in the cold air, words about faithful service and the Lord's design, words that Dessa received in her ears but could not move any further into herself. Calvin Whitmore had been 31 years old. A geologist by training, a wanderer by inclination, a man who could spend 40 minutes looking at a single piece of rock with the focused pleasure most people reserved for sunsets or first kisses. He had walked every ridge and cut of the land around Copperhead Gulch with a notebook in one hand and a steel-headed hammer in the other. He had loved this country the way a man loves a thing he chose freely. He had loved Dessa more than he loved any of it, and she had known that without him ever having to say so, because love at its truest is not a declaration but a posture, the consistent angle of a person's attention. A rockslide had killed him on a survey run for the railroad company. The foreman who came to the door said it was quick. Dessa did not believe him. She had been around enough endings to know that quick was something the living told themselves to make the wait bearable. The people of Copperhead Gulch stood at a respectful distance from the grave, their faces arranged into the correct shapes of sympathy. Dessa looked past them, past the rows of people she had known for 4 years, past the women whose names she could match to their Wednesday pie contributions and their Sunday pew preferences. She found Harlan Beckett standing slightly apart from the others with his hat held in both hands at his waist. I was looking at the Whitmore cabin visible up the slope through the bare aspen trunks. He was looking at it the way a carpenter looks at a chair he built poorly and is waiting to see fail. Dessa understood in that moment with a clarity that had nothing to do with the Reverend's prayers exactly what was coming. She thought pity would be gentler than whatever that look was. She was wrong about that too. The first basket arrived 3 days after the funeral. Mrs. Pratt, from the dry goods store. A loaf of bread, still warm, wrapped in cloth. A jar of apple preserves, a wedge of hard cheese. She stood in the doorway and looked past Dessa's shoulder into the cabin interior with an expression Dessa needed several days to correctly identify. It was the expression of someone who has already mentally removed the furniture. Sad, careful, finished. The basket was an act of conclusion, not of comfort. More baskets followed. 1 a day for the first week, then 2 some days, then neighbors. Dessa barely recognized laboring up the slope with contributions she could not use fast enough. By the end of April, the cabin held so much dried bread, she had begun feeding portions of it to the squirrels who worked the woodpile. She wept once over a jar of huckleberry preserves left by a woman whose name she could not remember, not from gratitude but from the sudden suffocating understanding of what the preserves actually meant. They meant we have already written you off. They meant we are saying goodbye while you are still standing. They meant in our minds you have already failed, already surrendered, already descended to the laundry house on 2nd Street where Mrs. Doyle hired widows and the steam from the vats turned everyone's hands the same raw shade of red by February. Dessa thanked each person who came. She said the right things. She closed the door each time and felt something accumulating in her chest, dense and cold, not quite grief, not quite anger, something more like the weight of a judgment she had not agreed to. Birch came back to languidly, that spring the way. A river comes back after a long drought. Tentatively at first a few words, then short sentences that arrived with visible effort. He began drawing again in early May, using the charcoal nubs he found in his father's coat pocket, pressing them against flat creek stones with the focused intensity Calvin had brought to everything he examined. He drew the same image repeatedly, a figure with a hammer, a mountain rising behind it. The figure had no face. Dessa would look at these drawings when Birch was sleeping, and she would feel something move in her chest that she could not name, something that lived in the narrow space between pride and mourning. The aspens went fully green by June. The high peaks lost the last of their snow except for the permanent white at the extreme summits. Dessa tended the garden. Calvin had mended the same dress 3 times, read by the oil lamp at night from the small collection of books Calvin had accumulated over the years. She could not open his journals. That was the one prohibition she held to strictly because she knew, with absolute certainty, that the moment she read his handwriting in any extended way she would hear his voice, and she was not yet strong enough to survive that. So the journal stayed in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed untouched, sealed, a kind of second burial she had chosen for practical reasons. Old Clem Farrow came up in the 2nd week of August to sell her some venison jerky, a wiry old man with tobacco-stained teeth and the outdoor person's habit of reading the landscape the way city people read newspapers. He stood at the gate and looked at the trees for a long time before he said anything. The aspens at the very tops, the ones that caught the highest wind, had already begun to turn. Not the full gold of September, but the first pale suggestion of it, the color that showed only when the tree was being warned of something. Clem did not dress it up. Means a hard one coming, Mrs. Whitmore. Old folks haven't seen that early turn sign since '64. That winter killed 30 people in this gulch. I was a boy, but I remember every name. His eyes moved from the trees to the cabin to her shoulders, measuring all 3 with the same brief, unsentimental assessment. If I were you, I would think about going down to the boarding house. I would think about it soon. He tipped his hat. He walked away down the slope without looking back because he was the kind of man who delivered verdicts cleanly. Dessa stood at the gate after he left with her hand on the gatepost. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun, the last warmth the day offered. The wind, even in August, carried something under its surface. Temperature, a small serrated edge like a knife held gently against the skin. Not a threat, not yet. A reminder of what was possible. Harlan Beckett came on a Tuesday 3 weeks after Clem Farrow's visit. She had been expecting him. She had in some ways been expecting him since the funeral, since the moment she caught his eyes on the cabin through the bare aspen trunks. He did not ride up. He walked, which told her something about how seriously he was taking the visit. A man who rode sent a message of convenience. A man who walked sent a message of gravity. She heard his boots on the gravel path she had laid along the front of the property. She came to the door before he knocked, which she could see threw him slightly off his prepared beginning. He climbed the 3 porch steps, testing each one with his full weight before committing to it, and she watched his eyes register what they found. The give in the 2nd board, the soft rot beginning in the 3rd, the gap where the door frame had pulled away from the log wall, the sag in the roofline center that meant the ridge beam was compromised. He saw the cabin the way a doctor sees a body that has begun failing in multiple systems simultaneously. He saw it the way he had trained himself to see structures honestly without the comfort of optimism. Mrs. Whitmore. He cleared his throat. I'll speak plainly. She told him she would prefer that. He said the cabin would not survive October at its best, and winter would come far worse than usual this year. The signs were clear to anyone who knew how to read them. He listed what would happen. The chinking would finish failing. The cold would find every gap. The snow load would break. What was already compromised in the roof, the floor would freeze. The walls would not hold heat for more than an hour after any fire. He said it without cruelty, with the flat precision of a man who had carried bodies out of cabins exactly like this one and was trying to prevent carrying one more. Then he offered the alternative item by item, the way a man reads from a list at the hardware counter. The timber rights on the property were worth $300, possibly $325 if he spoke to the mining concern personally. That was enough for a year at Mrs. Holcomb's boarding house. The laundry took on reliable workers. Mrs. Doyle had lost 2 girls to marriages that spring. There was a proper school for the boy on Pine Street, a good teacher, other children his age. Dessa let him finish. Then, I have already buried a husband, Mr. Beckett. He stopped. She watched his face do the thing she had been watching faces do for 4 months. The brief, involuntary recognition that she was a full person, followed immediately by the quiet retreat from that recognition, because full personhood complicated what he was trying to accomplish. I am not going to bury his land, not yet. He looked at her, then truly looked, perhaps for the first time since the funeral. I was not a stupid man. She had never thought he was stupid. Smart men could be wrong in ways that stupid men were too cautious to attempt. Sentiment is not shelter, Mrs. Whitmore. She held his gaze without flinching. No, but neither is a laundry. He was quiet for a moment. She said she would think on it. She thanked him for coming up. He waited hat in hand for her to change her position, because most people did when he held his long enough. She did not move. He put his hat back on. He walked down the steps, testing each one again on the descent, and stopped at the gate. He looked back at her once. Winter is not a thing you negotiate with. I have seen what it does to a cabin like this one. I have helped carry the bodies out after. His voice was not unkind. That was almost the hardest part. Do not make me carry yours. He left. Dessa stood on the porch until he was gone from sight, until even the sound of his boots on the gravel had faded into the ordinary noise of the afternoon. Her hands were shaking against her sides. She did not know yet whether that was fear or fury. She cried for 2 days. She is not proud of that. 2 full days of grief that had been building since April, since the moment the foreman knocked on her door and removed Calvin from the world with a few careful sentences. 2 days of the particular suffocation that comes from being seen only as a problem, from being offered the correct solution to your existence, from understanding that an entire community has already written the end of your story before you have finished the middle. Birch sat on the floor beside her chair and put his small hand on her knee, and did not speak, because there is a wisdom in 6-year-olds that adults have mostly educated out of themselves, the wisdom of knowing when presence is more useful than words. On the 3rd day the tears simply stopped. Not from resolution or peace, but from depletion, the way a rain stops when the clouds have given everything they had. What remained when the rain stopped was clear and cold and extremely still, like the surface of a creek in the first hard freeze before the snow covers it. She would not go to the laundry. She would not raise Birch in Mrs. Holcomb's boarding house on the charity of whoever happened to feel generous that week. She would not sell Calvin's land. She did not know yet what she would do instead. She knew only what she would not, which was enough for the moment. That night she put Birch to bed under 3 quilts. She waited until his breathing settled into the deep, unconscious rhythm of sleep. Then she lit the oil lamp, went to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and opened it. Calvin's handwriting hit her like a hand across the face. She had been braced for it, as braced as a person can be for a thing they have never successfully braced for, but the reality of it was still physical, still a full-body event. The slant of his letters, the small hooks on certain characters, the way he formed his capital letters with a slight backward lean as if they were leaning into wind. She had to keep her palm flat on the page for a full minute before she could read a single word. Then she read. The first 3 journals were pure geology. Survey coordinates, rock classification, sample descriptions, the careful dry vocabulary of a man doing his professional work. She understood perhaps a third of the technical language. What she understood completely was the rhythm of his thinking, the way each entry built carefully on the last, the scrupulous honesty of a man who refused to speculate beyond what his instruments confirmed. She read for an hour without crying. That felt like an accomplishment of a significant kind. The 4th journal was different in ways she noticed immediately. Smaller than the others, the leather cover cracked at the spine, the pages thinner and more yellowed. The handwriting inside was not Calvin's. Someone else had written the original entries in a cramped, careful script, and Calvin had translated the words into English in his own hand in the margins, working through the text methodically, leaving no passage untranslated. He had written on the inside front cover, "From the journal of my great-grandmother Mira Ashby, stonemason's wife, Western Pennsylvania, 1820 to 1855. Dessa bent closer to the lamp. Mira Ashby, she learned in the first few pages, had not written about stone the way Calvin wrote about stone, as material, as resource, as a puzzle of composition to be solved. Mira wrote about stone the way some people write about living things, with attention to its behavior over time, its habits, its particular forms of generosity. She wrote about heat as a relationship rather than a transaction. The young men build walls against the winter, Mira had written in Dessa's hands now through Calvin's careful translation. They cut the timber, they saw the boards, they make a box, they stuff the box with rags, they fight the wind with thin wood and angry fires. The old men who have buried their fathers know better. The wise woman invites the mountain into her home. Dessa read that sentence 3 times. The wise woman invites the mountain into her home. She set her fingertip on the words and left it there. Mira wrote about a particular kind of stone hearth, the kind her husband Earl had learned from his father and grandfather before him, men who had built in the mountains of western Pennsylvania before there was a Pennsylvania to speak of. The principle was not complicated, but it required patience and a willingness to work against instinct. You built the firebox small and burned a hot, brief fire once each day. The smoke from that fire did not travel directly upward and out. Instead, it was channeled through a series of internal passages built into the body of the hearth itself, long horizontal runs of brick that forced the smoke to surrender its heat before it escaped. By the time the exhaust reached the chimney, it was barely warm. The heat had been deposited into the mass of the stone. The stone held that heat for hours, releasing it slowly and evenly into the room, into the floor, into the sleeping bodies pressed against the warm walls. You were not fighting the cold. You were asking something older than cold to protect you. Mira wrote about houses built into hillsides, rooms that used the earth itself as insulation, stables carved into natural rock formations where horses wintered in warmth without consuming extraordinary amounts of fuel. She wrote about her husband's cousin, a man named Holt Ashby, which struck Dessa as an odd coincidence of names, who had built a 2-room dwelling against a granite outcropping in the Allegheny High Country and wintered there for 30 years with minimal fuel, emerging each March no worse than when he had gone in, sometimes better. The earth is not dead, Mira had written. The earth is a slow, warm animal, and her heart is a furnace. Lay your home against her ribs. She will keep you. Dessa read until the oil in the lamp burned low and the flame began to gutter at its edges. She sat in the near darkness for a long time after. She thought about Calvin. She thought about why he had chosen to spend his evenings translating this particular document, this journal, from a woman who had been dead for 30 years, translating it word by careful word when Dessa had assumed he was updating his survey notes. He had never mentioned it to her. He had never said, "Here is something useful I am preserving." He had simply done it in the lamp-lit evenings of their shared life, and left it where she would eventually find it. She could not decide if she was supposed to feel something in particular about that. She felt mostly that she had been seen by someone who was no longer present to be thanked. The last journal, the newest. Its leather barely broken in at the spine held a single folded piece of paper tucked between the final 2 pages. A drop of red wax had sealed the fold. Her name was written on the outside in Calvin's hand. She held it for longer than she had intended to. Then she opened it. Calvin had written the letter in March of 1885, 6 weeks before his death. He wrote that he had a feeling, the kind of feeling that men in his profession sometimes developed about certain situations and certain people, a feeling he could not quantify but had learned over years to take seriously. There was a man at the railroad survey site whose behavior Calvin did not trust. He did not write the man's name. He wrote instead, "I am writing this in case the feeling turns out to be a thing rather than nothing. If you are reading this, Dessa, I am gone. I am so sorry. I had 100 more things I wanted to say to you, and I will only manage to say one. Open the cedar chest. Find the 4th journal. There is a map inside. The tunnel at the back of our property is not the failure everyone called it. It is something I did not have enough time to fully understand, but I know what it is the beginning of. 60 feet in the rock is warm, not weather warm, not sun warm, warm from underneath. I do not know the full explanation yet, but I know it matters. Read my great-grandmother's journal. Mira Ashby knew how to live in the bones of a mountain. Her people knew. Yours will." Then, in handwriting that pressed harder on the page than his usual careful script, "Dessa, you are stronger than you know. When I am not there to tell you, you will not believe this. So believe me now on this paper while I am still the person who knows you better than you know yourself. You are stronger than you know. You have always been. You think the strength you feel in this house comes from me. It does not. It was yours before I arrived, and it will be yours long after. Invite the mountain into our home. Build the fire small. Build the stone large. Hold our boy. I will find you in the warm rock. Calvin." Dessa sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. The lamp had burned out completely. The room held only the thin gray light of the moon through the single window Calvin had fitted with such care. The one window in the cabin he had glazed himself rather than using oilskin because he wanted her to have real glass clear light, something that didn't blur the world outside. He had known. Certainly not with the confidence of prophecy, but with the quiet awareness of a man who trusted his own perceptions. He had sensed something dangerous in the situation at the survey site, and he had done what he could to prepare her for what that danger might mean, and he had done it without alarming her, without burdening their last weeks together with fear. He had just quietly translated a dead woman's journal and drawn a map and written a letter and tucked it where she would find it when she needed it most. In her chest, where the heavy, cold thing had settled over the past 4 months, something shifted. Not disappeared, changed shape. The cold thing had been made of other people's conclusions about her future. This new thing was smaller, hotter, the shape of a question she had not known she was allowed to ask. She rose before full light the next morning. Left a note for Birch on the table. Mama is at the back of the property. Stay inside. I will be home before noon. She took the lantern, the matches, the map. She walked the half-mile to the back of the Whitmore land in a state she could only later describe as a kind of controlled fever, purposeful but slightly outside herself, the way certain decisions feel when they are being made at a level deeper than conscious choice. The grass was stiff with frost. Her breath came out in soft bursts. She found the tunnel entrance where the map placed it, a wound in the base of the ridge choked with rockfall debris and the dry thorned vines that moved into any undisturbed ground within a season. She had walked past this spot dozens of times without stopping. The men in town called it Calvin's folly, his one failed venture, the hole he had dug in the wrong place looking for the wrong thing. She set the lantern down. She began to pull. Her hands, shaped by years of careful domestic work, found this kind of labor genuinely foreign, the rough edges of stone against her palms, the resistance of root systems she had to work around or through. Within 10 minutes, the skin on both hands had opened in small places. She kept working. She cleared the entrance enough to get through, lit the lantern, got down on her hands and knees. The first thing she noticed was the silence. The wind, which had been a constant presence all morning, stopped completely at the tunnel mouth. Not reduced. Stopped. The world above the ground carried on without her. The second thing was the air. Not cold in the way the October morning was cold, not moving, not searching. A different quality. Entirely. The still deep cold of a root cellar. The cold of something that had been sealed and preserved. She crawled. 10 feet 20, the quartz veins in the granite walls catching the lantern light and throwing it back in small scattered points. 30 feet in, she paused and held her palm against the stone wall. The stone was cold. The air brushing her cheek was not cold. She could not call it warm. She could call it the temperature of a closed room, a still and quiet indoor room 60 feet inside a mountain in late October. She kept crawling. 40 feet 50. At 60, the tunnel ended. A solid wall of granite quartz veined, catching the light the way all the walls did, beautiful, and as Calvin had written, entirely without commercial value. She sat back on her heels. She raised the lantern. She looked at the wall for a long moment. Then she took off her work glove and pressed her bare palm flat against the stone. She made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound, involuntary, the kind a person makes when something resolves that they did not know was unresolved. The stone was warm. Not stove warm, not the warmth of a thing that had absorbed heat from an external source. This was something underneath heat, something that did not depend on fire or sun or any other agency she could name. The warmth of a living thing at rest, patient, ancient, indifferent to the seasons happening 60 feet above it. She kept her hand on the stone. She closed her eyes. She thought of Mira Ashby writing in the mountains of Pennsylvania decades before Dessa was born, "The earth is a slow, warm animal, and her heart is a furnace. Lay your home against her ribs." She opened her eyes. She crawled back out into the October morning, which was very bright and very cold after the tunnel's dark stillness. She emerged on her hands and knees onto the frost-stiff grass covered in rock dust. Her dress ruined, her hands raw, her mind running at a speed that felt almost physical. The heavy, cold thing in her chest was gone. In its place, a plan. The plan was frightening. The plan was the most alive thing she had felt since April. She told Birch at breakfast. She had considered how to say it, whether to say it at all to a 6-year-old, and concluded that what Birch needed most was not protection from difficult information but consistent truth. She set his oatmeal in front of him. "Birch, I want to tell you something. We are going to live inside the mountain." He looked up at her. He chewed, swallowed. "Like a bear," she told him, a little like a bear. "I thought about this with visible seriousness." His father's thinking face arriving in miniature on his small features. "Will Papa's pictures come too?" She told him, "Yes, all of them." He thought again. "All right," he said, and returned his attention to his oatmeal. Dessa turned to the stove so he would not see her face. 6 years old. All right. He had more faith in her than she had accumulated in herself, and she understood in that moment that she was going to have to grow into his certainty, that it was the most useful thing he could have given her, better than comfort, better than patience. A direction. She began that same day. She did not wait for the plan to feel less frightening. Frightening was the ground condition. She would work in it or she would not work at all. She went out to the tunnel with the measuring rope Calvin kept in the shed. 60 feet total. The last 20 would be the living chamber. The middle 20 a passage. The first 20 storage and a windbreak entry. She would need the floor cleared. She would need it level. She would need stone for the floor surface and clay from the creek bank and dry grass and sand for the mortar mixture. She would need thousands of bricks fired in a kiln she did not yet own to build the stone hearth that Mira Ashby's family had called by the old Pennsylvania name, the fire that stone remembers, because when you built it right, the stone did not forget. She had a shovel, a pickaxe, the map, the dead woman's journal, and one instruction that had started to feel less like a metaphor and more like a physical law: build the fire small, build the stone large. She started with the shovel. The first day she cleared rubble from the tunnel entrance until her arms failed in a way that was entirely different from ordinary fatigue, a deep-down depletion of the muscles themselves rather than the surface tiredness she was accustomed to. She slept that night with the particular completeness of someone who has used everything she had. She woke before dawn and went back. By the end of the first week, she had the entry chamber mostly cleared. She had dug a clay pit at the creek bank using Calvin's prospecting tools and begun experimenting with mixtures, clay and sand and dried grass, twisted into short lengths, the formula Mira had described with such precision in the translated journal. Her first attempts crumbled when dry. She adjusted the ratios. She tried again. Birch watched her work for 2 days from the flat rock outside the tunnel mouth, drawing in the sketchbook with his father's charcoal nubs filling pages with images of the tunnel entrance, the clay pit. Dessa on her knees pressing mixture into the rough wooden forms she had built to shape the bricks. On the third day he climbed down from the flat rock, picked up a small stone from the debris pile, carried it to the spot Dessa had designated for spoil material, set it down, walked back, picked up another. She did not remark on this. She did not make it a moment. She just kept working. When he came back with the third stone and held it up at the edge of her vision, she shifted the wheelbarrow handle toward him without looking up, and he put the stone in with the others. By the end of the first week of working together, his palms were as marked as hers. She thought about telling him to stop. She chose not to. He had lost his father in the spring. Grief in children moves through the body differently than it moves through adults. It needed somewhere to go. Work was somewhere. So they worked, the two of them, in the quiet that had become their natural mode of being together. A quiet full of small, consequential sounds, stone on stone, the scrape of the shovel, the distant creek. Old Clem Farrow passed on the trail below the property in the second week of September and paused long enough to watch what Dessa was doing at the clay pit. He did not come up. He stood on the trail at a distance with his hand shading his eyes and watched for a few minutes. Then he walked on without a word, which told her the gossip had already started below. The town of Copperhead Gulch noticed before it understood. At first, the women along Main Street assumed she was shoring up the cabin foundation, a futile but recognizable kind of determination, and their sympathy warmed slightly in response. Then she stopped working on the cabin entirely. Then she built the kiln. The kiln was a beehive shape of stacked stone, ugly and functional, producing heat in a column of smoke visible from the lower valley on still days. The bricks that came out of it were misshapen and lumpy and the color of dried blood, but they were hard. Whatever. Dessa Whitmore was building, the women in the dry goods store told each other it was not a patch on the original cabin. The conversation in Mrs. Pratt's store changed texture when Dessa came in for nails in late September. Silence arrived a second before the bell above the door stopped ringing. The smiles held their positions a beat too long. "Dessa, dear, are you eating enough? People have been saying." Dessa asked what people had been saying, but Mrs. Pratt only weighed out the nails and offered a tighter smile in exchange for the question. Dessa walked home with the nails in a cloth sack. She knew exactly what they were saying. The widow had gone strange. The widow was digging a hole. The widow was going to bury herself and her boy in the mountain while the season ran out. It had taken less than a month for pity to complete its natural transformation into something with sharper edges, something said in lower voices in better lighting. They were not yet calling it madness. They were building toward it the way a storm builds pressure before event. What none of them knew, because Dessa had not spoken of it, was that she had found the fourth journal. She had read every word of Mira Ashby's translated testament. She had pressed her bare palm against 60 feet of granite at the end of Calvin's Folly and felt the mountain breathing. She had read a letter from her dead husband that said, "You are stronger than you know." They could not know what she knew. They were working with visible evidence. A woman alone, a failing property, a Colorado October, with its particular cold that arrived like a closing argument. From where they stood, what Dessa was doing looked exactly like the last dignified stages of a collapse. What it actually was the first stages of something none of them had a name for yet. The aspens along Red Tail Ridge had all turned gold by the first week of October. Every tree top to bottom a complete and final gold the way they went only when the season was entirely over. The first snow was 11 days away, though no one in Copperhead Gulch knew that yet. Dessa Whitmore stood at the entrance to the tunnel she was converting into her home and felt the wind's edge and understood with the same physical certainty she had felt when she pressed her palm against the warm granite that whatever she was building in borrowed time. She picked up another brick. She set it in the wet mortar exactly where Mira Ashby's translated instructions told her to set it. Very far away through the walls of the mountain, through the warm stone, her son's voice came to her in the tuneless hum he had started in the past week, the sound of a person who is finding slowly through their own private means a reason to continue. She was not yet finished being afraid. But the fear had changed shape, thinned out from the crushing weight it had been in the months after April, into something narrow and navigable, something she could walk beside without being stopped. The widow they had buried in their minds was not finished. She had not yet built the fire. She had not yet learned how to invite the mountain home. That part was still coming. Willa Drummond arrived without announcement on a cold October morning when the frost had thickened overnight from a suggestion to a fact. Dessa was at the creek bank hauling flat stones for the chamber floor, her boots soaked through at the toes, her breath making quick white clouds with each effort. Birch sat on a dry boulder upstream, sorting the stones she had already pulled, organizing them by size with the systematic patience his father had applied to rock samples, largest to smallest. A row of flat gray discs lined up along the bank like a sentence in a language Dessa was only beginning to learn to read. The voice came from the path above. "You are building a stone hearth." Not a question, a recognition. Dessa straightened. The woman on the path was small in the way certain old trees are small, reduced in height but not in presence, dense with something that had been compressed over decades into a form that took up less space than it contained. 70 years old, perhaps more. A face mapped by weather into deep, precise lines. Eyes of a pale gray blue that held a startling directness. She wore a man's wool coat several sizes too large, belted at the waist with a length of leather cord, and she carried a walking stick of black polished wood that she held slightly off the ground as if she did not actually need it but had learned to bring it for the benefit of people who found the idea of a woman her age without support unsettling. Dessa knew who she was. Everyone in Copperhead Gulch knew who she was in the way a town knows the person it has decided to be afraid of. Willa Drummond lived alone in a cabin 2 miles west through the pines past the old church foundation. The women along Main Street did not discuss her directly. They mentioned her indirectly in the way they mentioned other things they considered dangerous, briefly with lowered voices followed by a deliberate change of subject. The children had various theories, none of them generous. Dessa had passed her once at Mrs. Pratt's counter 3 years back and they had not spoken, and Dessa had thought nothing of it at the time, which she now recognized as one of the small failures of her previous life. "With clay alone or with fired aggregate mixed in?" Willa asked, still on the path, still not moving closer. Dessa told her she had been using clay with sand and dry grass twisted in following the instructions in a journal she had found. Willa descended the path, then carefully, but without hesitation, navigating the slope with the particular efficiency of someone who had been walking this kind of ground for 50 years. She stopped a few feet from Dessa. She looked at the clay pit. She looked at the kiln. She looked at the stack of bricks drying under a canvas tarp. She looked at Dessa with the same unhurried attention she had given everything else, neither kind nor unkind, simply accurate. "You are doing several things wrong," she said. "But you are doing them. That is not nothing." Then her expression shifted in a way that rearranged the meaning of her whole face. "My husband came to me last spring," she said. "Calvin Whitmore. He had found a journal about stone hearth construction and he wanted to understand what he was reading. He asked me questions for 2 hours. He listened the way Earl used to listen, with his whole attention without hurrying toward the next thing he wanted to say. I thought he would build." She paused. A precise and chosen pause. "Then he died. I thought the knowledge would die with me. I have been waiting 40 years for someone in this town to build one of these hearths. I had decided it would not happen in my lifetime." Dessa's throat had closed in the way it sometimes closed when she was offered something she had stopped expecting. She nodded because it was what her body could manage. Willa's hand came forward, small and very dry, and settled on Dessa's wrist with a pressure that was neither sympathetic nor sentimental, but simply present, one person acknowledging another's existence without qualification. "Tonight you come to my cabin. I have the drawings Earl made before he died. He built stone hearths for 30 years and he drew every detail of every one. We will look at the drawings together. She released Dessa's wrist. Then, the boy is small but he is willing. A child who works beside his mother learns that hard things are survivable. Use him. Birch had come down from his boulder to stand several feet away watching. Dessa heard him. "Mama, is that a witch?" The laugh that came out of her arrived without permission, genuine, the first unguarded laugh since April, the kind that arrives not because something is funny but because something true has been said in the wrong context. "No, my love," she told him when she had control of her voice again. "That is a teacher." Willa came every morning after that up the path at first light with her black stick and the leather satchel on her shoulder that held Earl Drummond's drawings, 40 years old, executed in pencil on linen, the fold lines worn to the texture of fabric from decades of consultation. She would spread them on the flat stone outside the tunnel entrance. Weight the corners with creek pebbles point. This is the firebox throat. This is the first horizontal run. The angle here is not decorative. It controls where the heat stays and where it moves. If you lay the brick like this, the fire breathes. The gas travels where you want it. Dessa would look again. Her hands shook most mornings from the cold, from the substitute she had been using in place of coffee, from the sustained effort of learning something entirely new at a pace the approaching winter dictated rather than her own comfort. She asked once, pointing to a section of the drawing she could not interpret, "What happens if I build this angle at 5 degrees instead of the specified 7? Willa looked at her without expression. "Then you and the boy die of smoke inhalation in your sleep." Dessa adjusted the angle to 7 degrees. The first hearth was a test structure, deliberately so. Willa had been absolute on this point from the beginning. Every experienced hearth builder in the tradition Earl had inherited from his father had built a wrong hearth first. The point was not to avoid failure. The point was to experience failure at a scale that was survivable and educational rather than final. Dessa built the test hearth, 10 feet inside the tunnel, a small and somewhat ugly thing, proportioned correctly according to the drawings but lacking the mass of the real structure she intended to build in the inner chamber. She fed it a handful of kindling on a morning in mid-October with Birch watching from behind her left shoulder. She struck the match. The fire caught immediately, a clean, bright catch that looked for 1 full second like confirmation. Then the smoke came not up through the intended path but backward, a thick gray rope reversing through the firebox opening directly into their faces. Birch screamed. Dessa grabbed him by the back of his collar, got the wet cloth she had kept close specifically for this possibility across the lower half of his face, pushed him out through the tunnel ahead of her. They emerged coughing onto the path, eyes streaming, Birch making the specific quiet sounds of a child who is frightened at a level below the kind that produces volume. His voice when he could use it. "Mama? Did we die?" "We are entirely fine," she told him, her hand on the back of his head, her own lungs still burning. "We are standing outside on a cold morning and we are breathing good air. We did not die." Willa arrived up the path at the sound of the coughing. She surveyed the situation. The smoke still pouring from the tunnel entrance, the two of them on the path with smoke-reddened eyes. She said nothing for a measured interval. She placed her hand on Birch's shoulder. "Brave boy, now you have met the smoke. The smoke is honest. It says exactly what was built wrong." Her eyes found his. "What did the smoke tell you?" He thought about it with visible seriousness, wiping his face on his sleeve. "The hole was too small." She confirmed this without praise as a statement of engineering fact. The fire required more air than the opening provided. The fire is always greedy in this way. This is something you do not forget. She turned to Dessa. "Now we take it apart. We build again. This time you keep the boy outside until I have lit the fire myself and held it for 10 minutes. Dessa sat on the nearest rock. She put her face in her hands. The breath she was holding came out as something close to speech. "I almost killed him." The words once said sat between them on the cold air with their full weight. Willa's voice went sharp in a way that was not unkind but was not soft either. "Look at me." Dessa looked. "Every person who built one of these hearths before you built a wrong one first. Earl built a wrong one. His father before him. His grandfather. They all coughed smoke. They all sat with their faces in their hands. They all said exactly those words, 'I cannot do this.' Then they stood up, took the wrong hearth apart, built the right one. This is not a story about failure. This is a description of the process." She waited a beat. "The work does not change because you are afraid. The work only gets done or it does not." Dessa breathed. She breathed again. She took her hands from her face. "Birch." He was watching her with his father's watchful eyes. Help me take the wrong one apart. He nodded once the small gravity of him settling into the task before they had even moved toward the tunnel. They rebuilt it over 4 days. The second version drew cleanly. Dessa crouched by the firebox opening and watched the smoke travel in the direction she had designed it to travel, felt the heat begin to register in her palm, held a foot from the exterior surface of the hearth body. Not the sharp, aggressive warmth of a cast iron stove, but something underneath that slower, more deliberate, the warmth of a thing that had made a decision and intended to keep it. She turned away from the hearth so Willa would not see her face. The vandalism began in the second week of November. Dessa came out one morning to find 200 bricks destroyed, the ones that had not yet fully cured stomped into fragments and scattered. The footprints in the soft clay around the kiln were large, male, and unhurried, the prints of someone who had not been afraid of being caught. 2 weeks of work in pieces on the ground. Birch stood beside her, holding her hand, looking at the destruction with a stillness that was harder to witness than distress would have been. Bad people, Mama. She knelt beside him and pulled him in, held him against her chest. She told him yes, if someone had done this, that was the word for it. I was quiet for a moment against her collarbone. Will they come back? She made him a promise she was not certain she could keep. If they came back, they would be ready. She did not tell him that the fear she felt now was different in texture from any fear that had come before it. The cold, the structural failures, the approaching deadline of the season, those were forces without intention. This was intention. Someone had climbed her property in the dark and broken what she had built, not out of need but out of preference. There was a coldness in that which the weather could not approach. She did not sleep the second night. She wrapped herself in a blanket in the kiln yard with Calvin's old hunting rifle across her lap, unloaded, because she had found over the past months that she was not capable of loading it with sufficient resolution. She wanted the weight of it. She wanted the shape of it in her hands to communicate something to anyone approaching. The moon was high and very cold when she heard the footsteps on the path at somewhere past midnight. She was on her feet before the figure fully resolved. Howe was tall, wide through the shoulders, carrying a sledgehammer at his side, and he stopped completely when she rose from the shadow beside the kiln. She did not shout. She kept her voice level. That is far enough. Set the hammer down. The sound of it meeting the ground. Step into the light. He stepped. Owen Beckett, 24 years old, built on the same generous scale as his father, but quieter in every dimension, less certain of his own occupation of space. He stood in the moonlight with his shoulders dropped and his hands open at his sides, and his face wearing an expression that belonged to a much younger boy. The specific look of someone caught in the act of something he had already decided he did not want to be doing. Your father sent you. She said it as a fact rather than a question, because she already knew the answer. A long pause. Yes, ma'am. To break my bricks. Another pause, slightly shorter. Yes, ma'am. The first time as well. No pause this time. Yes, ma'am. She sat down on a flat stone. She set the rifle across her knees. She looked at this large and unhappy young man standing in the moonlight with his sledgehammer on the ground, and she felt with some surprise the specific quality of sympathy she had not expected to feel in this situation. Not for what he had done, for what it cost him to be the person his father had decided he should be. Owen, why did you come back tonight? He did not answer immediately. He was working toward something. She could see it in the tension around his jaw. When he spoke, the words came out carefully, like a person carrying something breakable over uneven ground. To stop, ma'am. To put the hammer in your woodpile so you would find it there untouched in the morning, so you would know somebody stood on your side without being able to say it straight out. The wind moved through the bare aspens on the ridge. A coyote called from very far away twice, then was silent. Something in Dessa's chest that had been sealed since April gave way in a small, specific place. Not the grief weight that had changed months ago, but something newer, the stone of her certainty that she was entirely alone in this. It cracked. A sound below hearing. She stood. She crossed to where he stood and held out the rifle. He took it by trained reflex, the automatic response of someone raised around firearms, then looked down at it with an expression of pure bewilderment. It is not loaded, she said. I have never managed to shoot one convincingly. She asked him why his father was afraid of her. He thought about it honestly before he answered, which she appreciated. Because if you live, ma'am, and if what you are building works the way it seems like it might work, then everything my father has built for 30 years is wrong. Not badly made. Just wrong. That is harder than badly made. She breathed out. Yes, she said. I think that is exactly it. She let the silence sit for a moment. Owen, do you have good nails? Cut nails from the mill? He looked up. He said he could get them the quality cut nails that were not available at the dry goods store, good iron stock from the sawmill supply. She told him to bring them. She told him that if his father asked whether he had come up here and broken her bricks, he should confirm it. He should describe it with sufficient conviction that his father believed him. Make it good. He needs to believe it completely. A slow, tired smile crossed his face, the smile of a person relieved to have a task that cost less than the one he had been given. Yes, ma'am. He walked off into the dark. She sat back down on the cold stone with an unloaded rifle in her hands, and thought about how grief convinces a person of their solitude, how completely it manufactures that particular lie. The bricks she had to remake consumed 4 days. Willa working alongside Dessa from first light. Neither of them acknowledging that the vandalism had set them behind a schedule, neither had stated aloud, but both were tracking against the sky. Willa would look up at the afternoon light sometimes with an expression that did not translate into words but communicated clearly. They were behind. There was no recovering the lost days. There was only continuing. The real snow came in on a Tuesday evening, the first serious snow, large deliberate flakes falling with the specific weight of something that intended to accumulate. They were eating their last meal in the cabin. The floor of the inner chamber, finished that afternoon. The move effectively complete now except for this final night. Birch pushed his bowl aside. "Mama, I am not hungry. My head hurts." She put her hand on his forehead. The heat radiating from his skin traveled through her palm and into her chest as a physical jolt of fear. She had not felt fear of that particular quality since the morning the foreman came to her door. She kept her expression steady. "Let me get a cloth." She wrung the cloth out in the water bucket and folded it across his forehead, settled him against her side on the chair, watched him. His eyes were glassy in a way that was distinct from sleepiness. His cheeks held color that was too bright, the false brightness of a fever beginning to climb. By midnight he was burning. By 2 in the morning he was speaking to people who were not present in the room. His dead father, a horse. Dessa had never heard him mention asking for a blanket he was already lying beneath. She stripped him down to his undershirt. She worked with cold water from the bucket cloth to forehead cloth to the back of his neck, watching the pulse at his throat, counting it, finding it too fast. She thought with a clarity that was the worst kind, "I have done this. I have brought him up here in October instead of going to the boarding house, and I have made him sick in a failing cabin while the real home is 60 feet away, not yet warm enough to sleep in." She was putting on her coat when the voice came from the cabin doorway. "Dessa." Not a question, not a greeting. Just her name spoken with the authority of someone who had been walking through worse weather than this for 7 decades. Willa Drummond stood in the doorway with snow on her coat shoulders, her satchel on her arm, her black stick planted at her side. She had walked 2 miles through the first real snowfall of the season at 2 in the morning. She was looking at Birch with the focused assessment of someone who has seen fevers in children before and knows how to read them. "Where are you going?" Dessa told her. The doctor was 4 miles below. She needed to get Birch there. She needed to go now. Willa's voice stayed level in a way that took effort. Dessa could hear underneath it. "If you carry a sick child into that town tonight, they will not give you the doctor. They will give you a verdict. They will say you are an unfit mother. They will say the boy is ill because of how you have been living. Beckett will make certain of it, and the women who have been watching you all fall will confirm it. They will take the boy from you." Dessa said no. Willa said, "You know that I am right. Look at me and tell me you do not know that I am right." The snow outside was coming down heavier now, audible against the cabin walls. Dessa stood with her coat on and her boots half-laced, and Birch on the chair behind her making small sounds she could not let herself hear clearly. She knew. She had always known. She had simply not wanted to know it tonight. Willa crossed the room. She set her hands on Dessa's shoulders. The pressure was light. The intention behind it was not. "I have done this before. With children of my own. With children of other people. Bring him in. Bring him to the warm." She let go. She was already opening her satchel. What came out of the satchel were things Dessa had no names for: dried plant material in cloth packets, a small tin of something dark, a bundle of bark strips. Willa set water to boil on the cabin stove with the efficiency of someone following a procedure she had performed many times. She combined materials in proportions she did not explain, stirred, tested the temperature against her wrist. She filled a spoon. "A little at a time," she said. "He does not need to swallow it all at once. He needs to take it steadily." They worked through the rest of the night together. A teaspoon at a time. Cold cloths replaced when they warmed. Willa sang, at one point, a low rhythmic sound. Dessa did not recognize something that had traveled with Willa through decades of her own private history, a song Earl must have heard in the Allegheny High Country from his father's people. Dessa sang what she knew, songs from Ohio, from her own childhood, some barely half-remembered. Birch drifted between these two women's voices like a small boat between two shores, neither fully awake nor fully underheld there in the space between. At 4 in the morning his temperature broke. Dessa felt it before she understood it, the quality of the heat against her palm, changing, subsiding from its terrible intensity to something that was still warm but recognizable as a child rather than as a crisis. His eyes opened, cleared, found her face. "Mama." His voice was ordinary in the way voices are ordinarily miraculous. "Did we eat supper yet?" She laughed until she was crying and cried until she could not distinguish between the two. She held him until Willa gently loosened her hands. "He needs air, not just love." She let go. She watched him slide back into the clean, unconscious sleep of genuine recovery, the kind that heals rather than the kind that frightens. She turned to Willa. She tried to speak. She could not produce the words. Willa stopped her with a raised hand. "No, not for this. This is not a debt going forward. This is a debt already owed." Dessa did not understand that. She would understand it soon. 3 nights later, Birch was well enough to sleep through until morning. They were living in the inner chamber by then, moved in across 2 careful trips with everything that mattered. The hearth had been firing for a week. The stone walls of the chamber had begun to change slowly, the surface temperature rising day by day as the mass of the structure charged with heat and learned to hold it. It was not yet the steady warmth it would become in January. It was the beginning of warmth, the first evidence of a promise being kept. Dessa sat by the lamp with the 4th journal in her lap. She had read the geology sections. She had read Mira Ashby's translated testament so many times she could reproduce long passages without looking at the page. She had not yet turned to the very end of the journal, the final pages she had briefly noted as blank on her first examination. Tonight she did not know why she turned there. She turned there. A single folded page tucked between the last 2 pages, sealed with red wax that had cracked along the fold. Her name on the front in Calvin's handwriting. She had already read his letter. She had found it in the last journal weeks ago. This was a different letter tucked in a different place, and the discovery of it unmade her in a way that the first letter had not, because the first letter she had been prepared for by the time she found it had built toward it across weeks of the work it had described. This one arrived without preparation. Calvin had written this letter earlier. The dates showed in the first week of March rather than later in the month. It was shorter. He had been less certain then of what he was preparing for, less sure that the feeling he carried about the survey site would materialize into anything requiring a letter at all. He wrote, "I do not know if you will ever need this. I am writing it because I find I cannot rest until I have. If you find it and find the other letter too, then you will know the feeling was real. I am sorry you are reading this. I am so sorry, Dessa." The middle of the letter repeated some of what she had already read: the warm rock, the journal, the instruction to use what was there. Then, in the last paragraph, something new. "There is a woman named Willa Drummond who lives alone past the old church site. The town has decided to be afraid of her. Do not be afraid of her. She knows more about stone hearths than anyone else in this county because her husband Earl knew, and she learned everything Earl knew over 30 years of watching him work. When I went to her in March, she showed me things I had not found in any written source. She wanted to help build something here. She had been waiting to help build something here. If you need her, go to her. Or wait. She may come to you." The lamp made its small sounds. Outside the chamber, beyond the passage, beyond the tunnel door, the snow continued falling in the dark. Dessa sat with both letters in her hands, the March one in her right, the later one in her left, Calvin's handwriting on both the same slant, the same small hooks. She understood something then that she had not understood completely before. This had not been accident. The journal, the map, the letters, none of it had been accident. Calvin had been assembling a set of instructions for her survival. Not morbidly, not in despair, but with the focused, practical love of a person who understood that love is not only a feeling but a set of preparations made in advance. He had been building a bridge for her to walk across after he was gone. She had been walking across it all fall without knowing who built it. The next morning she put on her coat and walked 2 miles west through pines to a cabin she had never visited. Willa was cutting onions at a small table when Dessa pushed open the unlocked door. A small stone hearth against the far wall, barely larger than a good-sized hat box, radiated a warmth that reached the doorway. Dessa stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment before she spoke. That was what it was capable of, that small, modest thing. That was what was possible. 3 weeks ago, she said, "You told me you had been waiting 40 years to pay a debt. I want to know what debt." Willa set the knife down. She wiped her hands on her apron. She gestured to the chair. Dessa sat. Willa poured water from the tin pot and pushed the cup across the table. She looked at her own hands for a long moment before she began. Her husband, Earl Drummond, had been a stonemason, born to it in the way some men are born to trades, as if the skill were structural rather than learned. He knew how to build stone hearths the way his father had built them in western Pennsylvania, a tradition carried in the hands rather than in books, passed from father to son across generations of men who understood that the mountain could be an ally if you were willing to learn its terms. When he came to Copperhead Gulch in 1844, he brought his drawings, his tools, his knowledge, 2 small children, and his wife. He wanted to build correctly. He had always built correctly. The town had opinions about correct. The town had arrived mostly from the eastern cities carrying their cast iron stove catalogs from the big manufacturers back east, their trust in the visible mechanism, the metal box that glowed red when it was working. They found Earl's approach primitive. They called it a pile of mud in more polite company. Earl was proud, as young men with knowledge often are proud, with a sensitivity to how his expertise was being received. He did not want to be the man who built the peasant hearth in the town where he had settled his family. He bought an iron stove. He built his cabin like the others. The winter of 1844 was hard enough. Anna, their daughter, 6 years old, died in January of lung sickness that the cold accelerated and the inadequate cabin could not slow. The iron stove glowed red every night. The room lost its heat by 3 in the morning every morning, the same failure on repeat, iron giving back nothing it had stored because iron stored nothing, heat going up and out through the gaps in the wood walls while the cold came in from below to replace it. Henry, 3 years old, died 2 weeks after his sister. Earl died the following spring, not of any physical cause the doctor could name. He sat down in a chair one afternoon and did not get up again. Willa had understood. His heart had stopped wanting to keep the arrangement going. "I built the stone hearth myself the first winter alone," Willa said, "from Earl's drawings. I sat in front of it and I cried every night for a month because my children were not there to feel what I had built. I have sat with this story for 40 years. There was no one to tell it to. The town did not want my story. They had already decided what I was." She reached across the table. Her hand covered Dessa's hand. "Then your husband came up my path with a dead woman's journal. He listened the way Earl listened. He took notes. He cared about getting it right. I thought the knowledge would survive after all. Then he died." Her grip did not change. "Then his widow started digging. Dessa, when I came down that path and saw what you were building, I was not helping a stranger. I was finishing a sentence I began 40 years ago. I was giving my children a warm burial finally, not in the cold. In the warm." Dessa was crying. She had not known she was going to cry. She nodded because speaking required a precision she did not currently have. Willa released her hand. She picked up the knife. She returned to the onions with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. "It is not me helping you. It is us helping each other. Helping them." She did not look up. "Now eat. I am making stew. Then we go back to your tunnel. The second horizontal run in the main hearth, the one you laid Thursday, the angle is wrong by 2 degrees. I measured it while you were with the boy." Dessa laughed briefly through what remained of the tears. "Yes, ma'am. The coffee substitute first. It is useful for grief." Dessa drank it. It was in its modest way exactly that. In the first week of December, Willa began climbing the low hill at the back of the Whitmore property each morning at dawn. She would stand there for 10 minutes looking north, sometimes longer, and then descend. Dessa watched from the kiln yard on the 3rd morning and waited until Willa reached the bottom of the hill before asking. Willa set her walking stick against the flat stone, sat down on it. Her face had a quality Dessa had not seen on it before, a particular stillness that she recognized after a moment as the stillness of someone who has received news they do not know how to deliver. "There is a sky coming," Willa said. "I have seen one sky like it in my life. I was a young woman. I was living in eastern Colorado then, in a valley north of here. The sky went the color of an old bruised yellow at the edges, and the wind stopped all at once, and the birds left without the usual gradual departure. 3 days later the storm came. The valley had 40 people in it." She stopped, started again. 23 survived. Dessa sat down on the flat stone beside her. The morning around them was ordinary cold, but still the kind of December morning that preceded nothing in particular by every visible measure. "When?" she asked. "A week, perhaps 2. The mountain is telling me in the way the mountain tells, which is not a way I can explain to anyone who has not learned to listen for it." Willa looked at the tunnel entrance. "Are we ready?" Dessa ran through it, the chamber floor warm and stable, the hearth fully charged after weeks of firing the flue, drawing clean food stored for 6 weeks at minimum, water in jars against freezing, birch recovered and well. "By the measures I know how to measure," she said. "Yes." Willa looked at her with an expression that was not comfort, not reassurance, something more difficult to receive than either. "There is no being ready for what is coming. There is only being inside the mountain when it arrives." She stood, retrieved her stick. "Dessa, when it starts, whoever comes to your door, open it. The mountain is large enough. She began moving toward the path. Willa. The old woman stopped. When the storm starts, will you come down to us? The smile that crossed Willa's face was the smile of a person who has made a decision about their own life and made it completely without regret or its performance. I have my own hearth, child. I have Earl's bones in my own ground. I have 40 years of knowing how to winter alone. She looked at Dessa with her pale, direct eyes. We will see each other in the spring. Dessa watched her go, down the path through the bare aspens until the trees closed behind her. She stood in the kiln yard for a long time in the December, cold, knowing something she could not yet name. Her hand pressed flat against the stone of the tunnel entrance the way she had once pressed it against the warm granite face 60 feet in. The stone was cold out here. The cold was the surface condition. Underneath was always the warmth patient already waiting. She went inside. She tended the fire. She put her hand on the wall of the inner chamber. The stone gave back everything it had been given, slowly, steadily, without drama. She closed her eyes. She thought of a man at a desk in the early spring writing a letter he hoped she would never need to read. She thought of a woman in Pennsylvania who had learned the terms of survival from her dead husband's drawings and sat alone beside a warm hearth for 40 years waiting for someone to teach. She thought of Mira Ashby Calvin's great-grandmother, gone 30 years before Dessa was born, who had written in a worn journal in her careful hand, "The wise woman invites the mountain into her home." The mountain was warm. The mountain had always been warm. The mountain did not care whether Copperhead Gulch believed in it. The sky, the color of an old bruise, came 8 days later. The sky arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the precise color Willa had described, the bruise yellow at the outer edges shading inward to a purple so deep it was nearly black at the center, a sky that looked less like weather than like consequence. Dessa was splitting the last of the backup kindling outside the tunnel entrance when she straightened, set the axe head on the ground, looked north, and understood that everything Willa had told her about this moment was accurate in every particular. The wind stopped between one breath and the next. Not tapered off. Stopped. The absence of it was louder than its presence had been, a specific and total quiet that pressed against the eardrums. AJ that had been working. The bare aspens above the property went silent in the middle of a cry, as if the sound had been cut with scissors. The air carried a smell. Dessa had no prior reference for old mineral. A smell that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the surface of the world. She felt a cold touch at the back of her neck and turned, and nothing was there except the stone of the mountain and the entrance to her home. She dropped the axe where she stood. She walked quickly to the old cabin where she had left a few final items she had told herself she would retrieve before dark. The box of matches, Calvin's rifle, the tin of black tea. Patience Aldrich had pressed into her hands the previous Sunday with the specific intensity of a woman giving away something she valued. She gathered these things. She went into the tunnel. She pulled the heavy oak door Owen had hung for her the week before and set the wooden wedge firm at the base. She walked the 60 feet of passage, the lantern making its familiar circle of warm light on the quartz-veined walls, and came into the inner chamber. Birch was awake, sitting upright on his mattress with Patience's goose-down quilt around his shoulders, his hair pushed into peaks from sleep, his dark eyes finding her immediately. "Mama." The wind stopped. She crossed to him, crouched at the edge of his mattress, smoothed the hair back from his face. She made the decision to tell him the truth, which was the only decision she ever seriously considered with him. Yes, the storm is coming tonight. The big one. Bigger than anyone in Copperhead Gulch has seen. He received this with the same stillness he brought to all difficult information. "Are we safe?" She held his gaze without looking away. "Yes, the mountain is going to keep us. Mama promises." Then his eyes shifted slightly, the shift of a 6-year-old who has thought past the first question to the one underneath it. "What about the other people?" Dessa looked at her son, this small, grave person who had worked beside her all fall with bloodied palms and no complaint, who had helped carry the wrong hearth apart without being asked twice. "If they come to us, we will keep them too." He thought about it. Like the bear keeps the cave. She told him exactly like that. He lay back down. She stood. She went to the hearth, which had been burning its morning cycle for 6 hours. The fire itself long since burned out the brick mass, now in full release, radiating its accumulated heat into the room at the steady and unhurried rate that iron could never match. She put her palm against the exterior surface and felt the warmth come back against her skin. Impatient, consistent, entirely unlike the aggressive heat of a stove at maximum effort. The chamber held 62 degrees. It would hold through the night without another stick of wood. She thought of Mira Ashby writing in a cold Pennsylvania winter about the nature of stone. It does not give what it has not received, and it does not waste what it holds. Outside, very far above them, The first hard pellets of the storm began to hit the ground. The noise the storm made at full strength was not the sound a wind makes when it moves through a landscape. It was the sound a thing makes when it has decided to take the landscape apart. By midnight, the gusts had risen past anything Dessa could have estimated from prior experience, a sustained roar with periodic surges that struck the tunnel door like something with intent, finding the edges, pushing at the join between the oak and the frame. The door held. Owen Beckett had built things to hold. She could hear the old cabin going somewhere up the slope. Structural sounds she recognized from the months of watching the building fail in slow motion, the accelerated version of that failing. She did not go to look. It was not her home anymore. The chamber was 60 degrees. Birch slept with the quilt around his shoulders, one hand curled near his face, his breathing the deep and regular breathing of a child who felt entirely safe. She watched him for a while in the lamplight, this boy who had said all right when she told him they were going to live inside the mountain, who had never once in all the months of difficulty asked her whether she was certain because he was 6 years old and his certainty about her was not yet conditional on evidence. She understood that she had spent the fall trying to earn a faith he had already given her unconditionally, and that this was one of the things children did for their parents that parents rarely understood while it was happening. She put one more piece of split aspen in the firebox, more from something like ceremony than necessity, watching the flames take hold of it. Immediately, watching the smoke begin its deliberate journey through the 7 horizontal runs of brick she had laid under Willa's supervision over the course of the fall. 7 turns, each one a place where the heat was asked to stop running and stay. She had thought about that principle more than once over the past months, the idea that what you wanted to keep, you had to build a structure for, you had to create the conditions under which it would slow down and remain. 3 miles below the ridge, Harlan Beckett was conducting a different kind of education. His parlor stove was a Monarch Royal, ordered from a manufacturer in St. Louis, freighted to Copperhead Gulch at considerable expense in the summer of 1881, the finest residential stove west of Denver by the salesman's account. It had performed adequately for 4 years, and Beckett had understood its performance as confirmation of a principle: quality materials properly installed were sufficient against any conditions the climate could produce. What the climate was currently producing was reconsidering that principle in real time. The surface temperature of the Monarch Royal was high enough to raise a blister on contact. Beckett stood before it with his palms extended and felt the heat radiating off the iron in visible waves, a shimmering that distorted the air between himself and the stove. The room temperature was 38 degrees. He had been feeding the stove continuously for 6 hours. He was burning through his oak supply at a rate that would exhaust it before morning. The heat the stove produced went up as heat does, and from up it went out through every gap in the board walls, through the imperfect joins in the window frames, through the ceiling to the second floor, and from there to the cold outside. For every degree the stove added to the room surrendered a degree through its skin, because the skin of the house was wood, was nothing, was the thinnest possible argument against the kind of cold the storm was delivering. Ruth sat on the settee with Ida and Cecily arranged against her. Under every coat the house owned, their breathing visible, their color not right. The younger one, Ida, had stopped shivering 2 hours before. Beckett knew what that meant. He had been knowing it without permitting the knowledge full access to his thinking since midnight. Shivering was the body's argument. When the body stopped arguing, it had made a different calculation. Ruth looked at her husband across the room with an expression he had seen on her face only twice before in 22 years of marriage, both times in circumstances involving serious danger to their children. She was not angry yet. She was arriving at it. The space between where she was now and where she was going was exactly the width of whatever he did next. He had been pushing a thought away for 3 hours. The thought was specific. It concerned a widow on a ridge 3 miles up the slope. A stone hearth he had called an expensive way to suffocate yourself, 60 feet of tunnel he had described as a damp tomb. He pushed the thought away each time because following it to its conclusion required him to accept a series of things about the past 8 months of his behavior that he was not yet prepared to accept. The thought came back each time with greater force, the way suppressed things do, with interest accumulated. At 6 a.m. he started on the green pine. There was no more dry oak. Green pine, burned wet, produced more smoke than heat, coated the flue with creosote at a rate that was its own kind of problem. The room went smokier. It did not go warmer. Ruth spoke into the deteriorating air of the parlor. Harlan, she was right about everything, wasn't she? It was not inflected as a question. He turned from the stove. He looked at his wife's face, which had passed through anger and come out the other side into something colder and more durable. He could not answer, because the answer was yes, fully and without qualification, and saying it aloud in this room with his daughter lying still under a pile of coats was more than he was currently capable of. The storm gave a brief window at noon 90 minutes, when the wind dropped to something bearable, the snow thinning to a steady fall from its earlier violence. He put on every layer he owned. Ruth stood in the doorway of the parlor and looked at him with her pale, exhausted face. He told her he was going up. She asked why. He said, "Because if she is alive, I need to know." Ruth asked why again, her voice stripped of everything ornamental. He made himself say the true thing. "Because I sent her there. Because I told her not to ask for help when the time came. I need to know what I have done." Ruth crossed the room. She put both cold hands on his face. "If you find them alive," she said, "bring them down. Bring everyone she has. I do not care anymore who is right. I care who is warm." Then her eyes holding his with a directness that bypassed everything else in the room. "Harlan, if you find them dead, do not come back to this house. Do you understand me? You sit with them up there. You do not come back here and tell me that." He nodded. He went out. What the climb cost him was not physical, though the physical cost was real enough: snow to his hips and the drifted sections to his chest in one place where the wind had driven it against the hillside into a consolidated wall he had to push through rather than step over. His left cheek froze in the first mile, his chin went numb. The skin around his eyes, the thin exposed skin he could not cover without losing his sight of the path, burned and then stopped burning, and that was worse. He fell twice in the second mile. Each time he rose and kept moving because there was no version of himself that stayed down on that slope. Not the person he had been at sunrise, not the person he was becoming with every step. Somewhere in the third mile, between the second fall and the place where the trail steepened toward the final approach, something in him broke. He had felt structural failures before, had put his hand on a compromised beam and felt the wrongness in it. Before the crack appeared the specific vibration of something that had been holding a load it was no longer adequate for. This was that sensation from the inside, the internal version of a thing giving way. Not his body, something else. The conviction he had built his professional life on, the certainty that if you used quality materials in proper proportions and followed established methods, you would produce a structure capable of sheltering the people inside it. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in the most specific possible way. The finest stove he could buy in the finest house he had built was killing his daughters at 38 degrees, while somewhere above him, a woman in a tunnel with a pile of homemade bricks was warm. He kept moving. He moved because Ida had stopped shivering, because Ruth had told him not to come back if he found them dead, because the person he had been when he said sentiment is not shelter was dead on this slope, already replaced by someone he did not yet recognize, but who understood that the next thing he did mattered in a way that very few things in his life had mattered. He came over the last rise and saw the cabin. The cabin was gone in the functional sense. One side caved entirely under the snow load. The door buried the chimney, leaning at an angle that indicated the interior was no longer providing meaningful structural support. No smoke, no light, no indication of occupation. Harlan Beckett went to his knees in the snow. He bent his head. He did not pray exactly, because he had never been a man who found the words for prayer came easily. He simply stopped moving and acknowledged that he had arrived too late, that the thing he had feared since October had happened, that a woman was dead in that ruin above the snow line, and a boy was dead beside her, that he had known what the cabin would do in a winter like this one, and had walked away down the slope in September, satisfied that he had performed his duty by warning her. He had performed his duty. His duty had not been adequate. He was still on his knees when he saw it. Past the cabin, further up the slope where the tunnel entrance sat against the base of the ridge under its clearing of wind-stripped brush, there was a shimmer in the air above the snow. Not smoke. Not vapor in the usual sense. A distortion, the specific optical effect of warm air rising through cold air. The same phenomenon visible above a summer road in July when the pavement gives back the heat it has held all day. It was rising from a point approximately at ground level, from a spot he recognized after a moment as the place where the tunnel entrance would be, under however many feet of drifted snow now covered it. He stared at this impossibility for a long count. Then he got to his feet. Then he walked toward it because there was nothing else to do. He found the entrance by the path of packed down snow that showed through the fresh accumulation where someone had been going in and out regularly for weeks. A slight compression, a subtle road leading into the ridge. He reached it. He felt it, a breath of warmth against his face, a slow exhalation from the tunnel mouth, the temperature of a room in which someone was living rather than of a hole in the ground in a Colorado blizzard. I went down onto his hands and knees. He pulled himself through. 10 feet in the storm became something heard through stone rather than experienced directly. 20 feet in the skin of his frozen face began to change, the patches that had gone numb beginning to register temperature again, which announced itself as pain, which was better than the alternative. He kept moving. 40 feet in the air was not cold in any way he would have described as cold under normal circumstances. 50 feet. He could see light ahead. He came around the slight bend in the passage and stopped. The room was 12 feet across, maybe 14. Granite walls rough-hewn. A floor of fitted flat stone smooth from wear. Against the far wall, the hearth massive, low-set dark brick, utterly silent, radiating a warmth he could feel from 20 feet away as a physical pressure against his thawed face. A wooden table, 2 chairs. 2 straw mattresses along the warm wall. A line strung across the width of the room with small garments drying on it. A box of wooden animals on the floor. A pot on the hearth's side grate producing a smell of something slow-cooked, something with root vegetables. Bread somewhere. The smell of bread. Dessa Whitmore sat at the table in a clean blue dress, her dark red-brown hair tied back, a piece of sewing in her hands. She was mending a tear in a small shirt. Her posture was entirely without tension, the posture of someone in a place where they felt no need to be alert. Birch lay on his stomach on the warm stone floor beside the hearth, a piece of charcoal in his hand, drawing on a flat slate. He wore a wool shirt with the sleeves pushed up. His feet were bare, the soles facing upward, pink from the floor's warmth. Beckett could not move. He remained on his hands and knees at the tunnel entrance with his mouth open. No sound available to him. His entire system occupied with processing what his senses were reporting. Birch looked up from his drawing. He looked at the man at the entrance without alarm, without surprise, with the calm, dark eyes of a child who has been raised to expect the world to deliver unusual things and has decided to be curious about them rather than frightened. "Mama," he said in the conversational tone of a person reporting a neutral fact. "There is a man at the door." Dessa turned. She set her sewing down. She looked at Harlan Beckett on his hands and knees in the entrance to her home, his face raw from frostburn, his eyes wet, his expensive coat crusted with the snow of a 3-mile climb in a blizzard. She did not say anything for a long moment. She did not make the face she had the right to make. She stood up. She walked across the warm stone floor in her stocking feet, unhurried, steady. She knelt down in front of him. "Mr. Beckett." He could not answer. She looked at his face with the kind of attention that is not pity and is not satisfaction and is not the triumphant confirmation of having been correct. It was the attention of someone taking accurate inventory of another person's condition. "You are cold," she said. "Come in." She helped him out of his coat. She removed his boots, which took some effort. The leather stiffened. She worked his hands between her own palms with the methodical efficiency of someone warming meat before cooking, not tenderly but effectively. She seated him at the table. She filled a bowl and set it in front of him. His hands shook too hard to manage a spoon without assistance, so she assisted without comment, 3 spoonfuls until he had enough heat in him to manage alone. Birch watched all of this from his place on the floor with the focused attention he gave to things he found interesting, then returned to his drawing. Beckett looked at what the boy was drawing. It was the room, the hearth, the 2 chairs, the drying line with its small garments, the proportions of the chamber rendered in charcoal with an accuracy that was startling from a 6-year-old hand. The boy was drawing his home. Beckett put his face in his hands. Dessa sat across the table with her own bowl. She ate. She let him cry in the same way she had let him into the room, without condition, without commentary, with the patience of someone who understands that some things need to complete themselves before they can be responded to. When he could speak, he said one word: "How?" She explained it without gloating, without the pedagogical performance of a person who has waited to deliver this information. She spoke plainly, the way she might explain a recipe or a piece of equipment. His stove made heat and released it immediately into the air. The heated air rose and escaped through every gap in the structure above it. Cold air entered from below to replace what was lost. He burned more fuel. The cycle repeated and accelerated. I was heating the open sky of Copperhead Gulch through the walls of his house, burning through his supply against an endless demand. Her hearth ran. A different negotiation. The fire paid for its passage through the brick, left its heat distributed through the mass of the stone. The stone held what it received and surrendered it slowly to the floor to the feet to the bodies of the people standing on it. The mountain around the chamber did not permit the cold to enter from any direction. She was not fighting the cold. She had gone underneath it. He sat with that for a long time. 30 years of building, 30 years of iron stoves and tight-fitted boards and the best lumber money could buy in western Colorado. 30 years of being correct by every measure he had known how to apply. He bent forward over the table and wept for the second time in that hour, differently from the first time, from a deeper place. Dessa reached across the table. She placed her hand on the back of his head the way you place a hand on a child who does not need to be told anything yet, who needs only the physical confirmation that they are not alone in their difficulty. She held it there. She did not speak. When he surfaced, my wife, the girls. Ida stopped shivering 2 hours before I left. The house is barely 40 degrees. I came up here to find out if I had already gotten you killed. He stopped. He could not complete the sentence about what he had come up here for after that. Dessa stood. She went to the hook on the wall and took down a heavy wool shirt of Calvin's that she had kept because it was the warmest thing on the property. She held it out. He protested. She said with a flatness that precluded further discussion, "You did not ask Mr. Beckett." "I did not wait to be asked." She laced her boots at the tunnel entrance. "Birch." He looked up. "We are going down to get Mr. Beckett's family. There may be others. You stay here. Stay against the hearth. Do not open the door for anyone except me. Tell me back." He repeated it without inflection, matter-of-factly, in the tone of a child who takes instructions seriously because he has learned they come from a serious place. She stood. She looked at Beckett. He asked why. She told him, "Because your wife has done nothing wrong. Because your daughters are 6 years old. Because if I leave them down there to die in order to make a point about who was correct in September, I become the kind of person who lets children freeze to prove an argument. I am not that person." She picked up the lantern. "There is no time. Come." The descent was faster than his climb had been. The path she knew by weeks of daily use, the same packed snow road Beckett had followed up. At his house, she helped him dig the door clear. Inside, Ruth was on the floor with both daughters under every coat in the building, Ida and Cecily arranged against her, the stove cold, the room at a temperature that was no longer ambiguous. Ruth looked up. She saw her husband. She saw the woman who came in behind him. For a moment her face went through something complicated and private. Then Dessa was already across the room, her hand on Ida's cheek, reading the temperature, reading the shallow pull of the child's breathing. "She is alive. We move now." Ruth asked where. "My home," Dessa said. "Right now, quickly." Ruth looked at her husband with the question that had no words. Beckett gave her the only honest answer he had left. One nod, brief, without decoration. He carried Ida. Ruth carried Cecily. Dessa went ahead with the lantern. On the way up the slope they stopped at the parsonage. Dessa went to the door without discussing it with anyone, knocked hard, waited. Reverend Aldrich opened it in his coat and scarf. Behind him in a freezing parlor, Patience Aldrich sat wrapped in 3 quilts, her lips showing the bluish tinge that Dessa had learned to read over the course of a long fall spent paying attention to what cold actually did to people. Dessa's voice. "Patience, get up, we are leaving." Patience began to say she was fine. Dessa said, "You are not fine. Get up, please." The Reverend began a sentence about imposition. Dessa looked at him with an expression that ended the sentence before it completed itself. "There is alive and there is dead, Reverend Aldrich. Please get your wife's coat." He got it. 4 more on the way up. The schoolteacher, Miss Varney, with her younger cousin who had come to visit in November and not been able to get back down the pass. 2 children whose father had gone for supplies the morning before the storm and whose mother had sickened overnight, the fever in her case running the wrong direction. The blacksmith's wife, 8 months along, whose husband had left for the doctor 4 hours before Beckett had left for the ridge and had not returned. Dessa did not ask permission at any of these doors. She assessed, she told people what was happening, she gave them the choice of coming or staying, and she told them what staying meant. Every person came. The line of them going up Redtail Ridge in the last of the afternoon light was 11 people moving through a gap in the storm that would close again within the hour. Dessa at the front with the lantern, Beckett at the rear with the blacksmith's wife on his arm, Birch's quilt bundled around her as additional insulation. She got them through the tunnel door. She moved everything that could be moved to the walls. She unrolled every blanket. She put Ida and Cecily directly on the stone floor in front of the hearth, with Patience Aldrich's goose-down quilt spread over both of them, and told the women nearest to arrange themselves along the warm wall and share body heat in both directions. She gave the blacksmith's wife the mattress and kept her close to the hearth. She put water on. 15 minutes after Ida Beckett was placed on the warm floor, the color in the child's face began to change. The blue tinge at the lips receded. Pink replaced it, then more pink, then the ordinary healthy color of a child who is warm and safe. Ruth Beckett watched this happen. She watched her daughter's face return from the place it had been going. She did not make a sound. She simply pressed her face against her husband's shoulder and stayed there for a long time. Dessa stirred the stew. She added what she had. She put bread to rise against the warm side of the hearth, 2 loaves, knowing she would need more by morning. She thought of Willa 2 miles west through the pines, alone in her small cabin with her small hearth and Earl's 40-year-old drawings and the photographs of children who had not survived to be warmed by the knowledge their father had carried. She thought, "Are you warm, Willa?" She did not know yet. She would not know for 2 more days when the storm would break, and she would fight through the drifts to the cabin and find the old woman sitting in her chair by the hearth. Alive, warm, talking quietly to photographs as if they had been participating in the conversation all along. The second night, with most of the 11 people asleep on the warm floor in arrangements that had stopped being embarrassing somewhere around midnight, Ruth Beckett came to sit across the table from Dessa, who was working the next morning's bread. Dessa. Her voice was low, careful, in the manner of someone preparing to say something that costs something. I need to tell you something that will be difficult. Dessa looked up. Ruth's eyes were steady, but the steadiness was maintained. I did not tell my husband to leave you alone this fall. I knew Calvin. He bought lumber from us 2 years ago. He came to supper once. I liked him very much. I sat in my parlor and listened to Harlan call you unfit and foolish, and I knew you were not, and I did not say so. For 8 months I said nothing. Dessa put the bread aside. She came around the table and sat next to Ruth. She thought about what was being asked of her, about whether she had what was being asked for yet, about the difference between what was true in the present moment and what might become true later. I will not tell you tonight that I forgive you, she said. I do not know yet if I do, and I do not say things I am not certain of. But I will tell you this. You are warm tonight. Your daughters are warm. You are here because I will not let people die in order to make a point. That is not about you being deserving or undeserving. I do not save people because they have earned it. I save them because they are in front of me and they are alive. She looked at Ruth directly. That is what I have for you tonight. It may be enough. It may grow into more. I do not know yet. Ruth took Dessa's hand. Her grip was firm, not desperate. It is enough, she said. For tonight it is exactly enough. They sat that way for a while on the bench with the sleeping people around them and the storm continuing outside and the stone warm against their feet. On the third day, Dessa prepared to go down again. Old Clem Farrow had a shack 1/2 mile off the main trail that she had been told was not built for this kind of weather, and she had not been able to reach it in the 2 previous rescue attempts because the path to it branched at a point that had been invisible under 4 feet of new snow. Beckett stepped in front of the tunnel door. Dessa. She told him to move. The wind has shifted. There is ice on the east section of the trail that you cannot see from above because the new snow is covering it. You will go over the edge of the cut. She said she would be careful. He said, I am 58 years old and I have been walking these ridges for 30 years in every condition this mountain produces. I know what the east cut looks like when it ices under new snow. I know where the edge is even when I cannot see it. You do not. He met her eyes. I sent you up this mountain in October to die. You did not die. You came down in the worst storm in 20 years and you brought my daughters back. Let me go get someone else. Let me make one small thing right. She looked at him. She moved away from the door. He returned 4 hours later with a young man named Pelham across his shoulders. The young man's leg broken where he had fallen trying to get out of Clem Farrow's shack and been pinned briefly by a collapsed section of the roof. Beckett set him down on a blanket near the hearth. He stood up. He turned to face Dessa. His voice, when he found it, was level in the way that things are level when they are working against considerable internal pressure. His mother was already gone when I got there. She had been trying to keep him warm. She had given him everything she had. He stopped. He started again. I sat with her for a while. I told her she was a good mother. I do not know if she heard me. I came back with the boy. Dessa put her hand on his arm. She said nothing. There was nothing to add to what had already been said. The storm ended on a Thursday morning. Dessa woke in the pre-dawn stillness and knew it was over before she opened her eyes, knew it by the quality of the quiet which had changed from the pressurized silence of the blizzard to the ordinary silence of a world under deep snow, the kind of silence that has settled rather than the kind being forced. She rose without waking anyone. She dressed. She went to the tunnel door and put her shoulder into it. 6 feet of drift on the other side. She worked at it, shoulder and hands, creating a crack, then a gap, then an opening large enough to climb through. She came out into this cold blue of a Colorado morning before sunrise, standing knee-deep in snow that sparkled in the first light coming over Redtail Ridge. The aspens were buried to half their height. The old cabin was a low mound of white, indistinguishable from any other feature of the snowed-over slope. Everything Calvin had built with his hands was under there. She did not feel what she expected to feel about that. What she felt was simpler and stranger. She felt that he was here in the warm rock below her feet, in the 60 feet of granite that had held through everything the winter sent in the hearth, that was still radiating the heat of yesterday's fire into the room where her son slept. She had invited the mountain into her home. The mountain had stayed. She started to laugh. It came out of her without warning or preamble, a full and physical laugh that had nothing performed in it. The laugh of someone who has arrived somewhere they were not certain they would reach. The laugh became something that was not quite either laughing or crying, and was fully both a sound for which English does not have a precise word, the sound of a person who has come through something that was genuinely uncertain in its outcome. A hand on her shoulder. Beckett beside her in the snow wearing Calvin's wool shirt under his coat. He had come through the tunnel behind her without her hearing him. He stood looking in the morning with the expression of a man who had not been sure he would see another one. Dessa? She turned to face him. He looked at the ruined mound that had been the cabin, at the unspoiled white of the slope, at the shimmer still rising faintly from the tunnel entrance where the warm air of the chamber met the cold of the morning. His voice was not the voice he had used in September on her porch. That voice was gone. This one was something that had been rebuilt from the ground up over the course of a night on the mountain and 3 days in a warm room watching his daughter's color come back. You did this. She shook her head. Calvin did this. Willa Drummond did this. Mira Ashby, who has been dead for 30 years, did this. A woman who sat alone in Pennsylvania and wrote down what she knew about stone did this. I listened. That is all I contributed. I did the listening. He was quiet for a moment. Will you teach us all of it? The hearth, the way of building into the ground, the way of thinking about heat that you are using. Will you teach it? She looked at him. She had spent 8 months watching this man represent everything the town knew about shelter and rightness and correct procedure. She had spent 8 months being wrong about almost nothing, while everyone around her assumed she was wrong about everything. She was not interested in making him feel worse about that than he already did. In the spring, she said, I will teach anyone who will sit still long enough to learn. His voice was quiet, settled. I will be first. I will sit still as long as it takes. She believed him. I know, Harlan. You will not be the last. She bent down. She took a handful of clean snow from the surface of the drift, the snow that had fallen last untouched the top layer. She put it in her mouth. It tasted like cold, tasted like altitude, tasted like something clean that had come a long way to arrive here. She stood up straight in the early light of a Colorado morning in the last days of the great blizzard of 1886. 27 years old, a widow, a mother, the person who had done the listening when the mountain offered itself as shelter. She turned. She went back through the tunnel. 28 people were going to need breakfast. The fire would want its morning feeding. The bread from last night needed to be assessed and supplemented. Birch would be awake soon with his sketchbook and his charcoal and his quiet, methodical approach to documenting the world around him. There was work to do. There had always been work to do. The difference now was that she was doing it in a warm room, in a home she had built with her own hands, from the instructions of a dead woman on land. Her husband had given her a map to find inside a mountain that had been keeping its warmth for 10,000 years and had not begrudged her a portion of it. In the spring, Willa Drummond walked into Copperhead Gulch on a morning when the last snow was melting from the eaves of the church, her black stick and her leather satchel, her pale eyes taking in the street she had been avoiding for 4 decades. Beckett met her at the edge of town with his hat in his hands and his head lowered. He told her what he owed her and said he did not have the words for it. She told him to build the hearths. Every house on Main Street. Start with the church, then the schoolhouse, then his own. He said yes, ma'am, to all of it. Owen built alongside his father that summer, and it turned out the son had a mason's hands in a way the father never quite had a feel for, the angle and the weight that could not be taught and could not be faked. The gift arriving in the second generation the way gifts sometimes do, looking for the right vessel. By the autumn of 1886, 6 houses in Copperhead Gulch held stone hearths. By 1888, 22. By 1890, every new structure built in the Gulch included at minimum a partial earth-sheltered foundation, and the phrase "a Whitmore hearth" had entered the vocabulary of the valley, as both a noun and a general descriptor, meaning built to last against the worst possible conditions. Dessa did not seek recognition. She did not apply for office or petition the town council or ask to have her name attached to anything. She added to the inner chamber, year by year, a second sleeping room, a small workshop where she hand-copied Mira Ashby's journal in clean, legible script and offered it to anyone who asked. She hung one line of Calvin's letter in a simple frame above the hearth at a height where Birch could read it every morning when he came in from his mattress. You are stronger than you know. She kept it there because she believed every person growing up in a house should have access to that information in a form they did not have to earn. The women of Copperhead Gulch came to her eventually one at a time, two at a time, with questions that were not always about construction. Mrs. Pratt came in the summer of 1887 with something she could not say directly for several minutes before she found the shape of it. The blacksmith's wife came with a question about her marriage. Ruth Beckett came in August with a question about herself that had taken her 2 years to form correctly. Dessa gave them all the same thing: the table, the chair, the cup, the kind of listening she had learned from the mountain, which did not rush toward resolution, which did not perform sympathy, which simply received what was offered, and held it with the same patience that stone held heat. Patience Aldrich came every Thursday, regular as weather. She became the best advertisement the listening chamber ever had, arriving with her rheumatism and her questions and her complete inability to leave without staying 2 hours longer than she planned. Birch grew up. He read his father's journals in the order they were written, understood the geology before he understood the personal history, came to the letter last when he was old enough to receive it without flinching. He studied earth science in Denver at 20, came home every summer to work the high cuts with his mother, married a schoolteacher named Sarah in 1904, who had the specific patience that the Whitmore household seemed to select for. Dessa gave them a small hearth for the wedding, fired it herself, showed Sarah the angles. Her one piece of advice to her son on his wedding morning: listen to her, Birch. Listen the way the mountain listens to the water. The water is always right. He did not understand this completely on the morning she said it. He came to understand it over the next 4 decades in increments, each one arriving at exactly the moment he needed it. The Copperhead Gulch Historical Society opened a one-room museum in 1906 at the corner of Main Street. It held photographs, Calvin's geological instruments, 3 of his journals. It held Mira Ashby's original document and Dessa's handwritten copy in a glass case side by side. It held Calvin's letter, the March one, the one he had written in case the feeling turned out to be a thing. On the wall in a frame, Beckett built himself from timber cut on Redtail Ridge, a single line written by Dessa Whitmore in the winter of 1886 after the storm, on the inside cover of the copy of Mira Ashby's journal that she had made for the town: men build walls to fight the world. The wise woman invites the mountain into her home. One way shouts, the other tells a story. Always listen to the story. Dessa Whitmore lived to 83. She was buried beside Calvin on the shoulder of Redtail Ridge in a small plot edged with the smooth creek stones he had been carrying home from surveys for the 4 years they had lived in this valley together. His version of flowers, his version of the thing you bring back to the person you love from the place you love most. The mountain above the grave is warm year-round, 60 feet down, in a specific and reliable way that geologists still find interesting. The stone has been warm for 10,000 years. It will be warm for 10,000 more. It does not know anything about blizzards. It does not know anything about widows. It knows only what it has always known, that heat properly held, given the right structure, the right patience, the right willingness to let it move at its own pace through its own chosen paths, does not disappear. It stays. It accumulates. It becomes the warmth that keeps the people who understood how to ask for it. Birch visited the grave every spring for the rest of his life. His daughter visited after him. She brought her children. The stones Calvin carried home are still there, smooth, various the colors of a geologist's collection, each one from a different cut on a different ridge, each one carried by the same hands, offered to the same person, kept long after both of them were gone. The mountain kept them all. It always does.